evening, everybody, and welcome. It's a real pleasure to welcome so many of you physically here to our lecture theatre at UCL. I know we've got a large online audience as well. Apologies for starting a little bit late. We're all ready to go now. I'd love to start by introducing our speaker, Sue Lynn Lewis, who's an associate professor in modern global history at the University of Bristol. Sue Lynn is a specialist in global and transnational history of the 20th century, with research interests in urban culture, civil society, activist networks, gender, migration, and decolonisation. The geographical focus of her work is primarily Southeast Asia, especially Burma, Malaysia, and Indonesia, as a means to examine broader Pan-Asian, Afro-Asian, and global connections. These topics are to the fore in her monograph, Cities in Motion, Urban Life and Cosmopolitanism in Southeast Asia, 1920 to 1940. Sue Lynn is currently leading an HRC-funded research project on Afro-Asian networks in the early Cold War, which examines the broad participation of activists, socialists, artists, and writers in the Afro-Asian solidarity movements. Other research at this time includes a project on socialist internationalism in the Afro-Asian world. This evening, Sue Lynn invites us to look again at the history of internationalism. As she writes in the abstract to tonight's lecture, the history of internationalism has tended to focus on power centres in the global north. But what happens when we flip our perspective and view internationalism from the point of view of the decolonising South? What do we get when we shift our focus from world leaders to the internationalism of activists, intellectuals, feminists, poets, artists, rebels, and insurgents operating in Asia and Africa? To answer these and other questions, please now join me in welcoming Dr. Sue Lynn Lewis to give this evening's RHS lecture, Decolonising the History of Internationalism.
I want to extend a great note of thanks to Margot Finn and Emma Griffin for giving me the honor of speaking to you today. And I thank everyone here or at home who's given up part of their Friday evening to attend or tune in. As someone involved in efforts to decolonize scholarly practices, I've been very grateful to the Society and all colleagues involved in its 2018 report on race, equality, inclusion for pioneering efforts to highlight issues of racial underrepresentation and make the discipline more inclusive. That report insisted on the importance of globalizing and diversifying our teaching curriculum, including challenging Eurocentric perspectives and critically engaging with imperial legacies. Following some of that work, I wanted to use this lecture as an opportunity to think about how we might decolonize our research practices. I'll be speaking especially to the field of international history, a field which I've long observed from the sidelines and which I find myself increasingly in dialogue with. Both global and international history are fields that have grown exceedingly popular, both for us as researchers and our students in the last 2 decades. They promise a wider, connected, and comparative outlook to a discipline that has long been dominated by Western European and American history. But like any field of history, we must constantly consider the actors on which we focus, the methods we use, and the questions we are asking of the field. In this lecture, I hope first to highlight ways we might decolonize the content of international history, amplifying some of the excellent work that has been done recently in the name of internationalism at a more subversive level from the viewpoint of the global South. And here I'll also be speaking about some of my own collaborations in this field. Secondly, I also want to highlight some of the new perspectives that might emerge through methodologies of collaborative research, both with scholars in the academy, with research specialities across the global South, and with independent scholars, including activists and curators from South and Southeast Asia. Where global history meant overcoming history's traditional focus on the nation state, focusing on mobility, interconnection, and exchange, international history was long predicated on the study of cooperation between states. The nation was a paramount category of analysis, even if historians recognize the way in which it morphed and changed. The study of international relations, which arose after World War II, focused exclusively on interstate relations between European countries. Recently, Patricia Owens and Katarina Rissler brought together a range of scholars to interrogate the early canon of international intellectual history, particularly in its mission of women. Within that collection, scholars of Black internationalist thought, including Keisha Blaine, Imabong Umaran, and Rabi Shiliam, drew our attention to African-American women intellectuals engaged in the wider context of decolonization, Pan-Africanism, and Afro-Asianism, as they do in their recent books. These interventions have provided welcome and fundamental to enrich and decolonize the intellectual history of internationalism, globalizing the field, opening up questions of who gets counted as an intellectual, and addressing the power structures inherent within it. But the field's geographical myopia and its focus largely on actors and organizations based in Europe and America and their interactions with the wider world still needs urgent address. Over the past 2 decades, the global turn has invited a wider re-examination of the history of internationalism. Moving away from histories of great men and theories of internationalism, scholars have turned their attention to its practice, tending to focus on the history of liberal international institutions, including the League of Nations, the United Nations, and UNESCO, as well as humanitarian organizations, including Oxfam and Save the Children. Scholars, including Susan Peterson and Emily Bond, have importantly helped us trace the imperial roots of these liberal internationalist projects. More recently, others have shown how organizations like the League and the United Nations served as important anti-colonial platforms for Arab and Asian political organizers, including women. Some have shown how actors in colonial and post-colonial territories interacted and appealed to such institutions, as Erez Manella has shown in the Wilsonian Moment, where petitioners from Korea, Egypt, India, and China used the Paris Peace Conference as an occasion to articulate their own nationalist aims. Others have examined the rise of popular internationalism and transnational connections that emerged among the broader public and via cosmopolitan internationalists, including among anti-colonial actors in Europe and the United States. The locations of this internationalism has often been traced to cities like London, Paris, Berlin, and New York. As hubs for education, intellectual ferment, and migrant crossings, these were important sites for anti-colonial activists to form networks, often because their evasion of colonial regimes of surveillance. A new volume has explored the importance of the League Against Imperialism, which met in Brussels in 1927, drawing together Asian and African intellectuals, students, radicals, and communist-inspired revolutionaries. None of us can ignore the importance of these cities, particularly for the revolutionary heroes and political leaders of the Global South. But this might lead us to ask, to what extent do such histories place globetrotting nationalist elites and leading intellectuals, those who often left us with memoirs, at the center of the story of internationalism in the Global South? What does internationalism look like to those who never traveled anywhere? Internationalism, as Glenda Sluga has reminded us, can involve either the expression of an idea or international institutions themselves. Its history has been traced to the Enlightenment cosmopolitanism of Kant and Bentham, or 19th century institutions such as the Concert of Europe, or the internationalism of organizations like the Comintern, whose Moscow-based networks reached out like tentacles to the Global South. In this perspective, internationalism originates in the North and is diffused to the South. But what does internationalism mean if we root such ideas and institutions in the Global South? What new perspectives do we gain from tracing lineages of internationalism as specialists in South and Southeast Asia, the African continent, Latin America, or the Caribbean? In the past couple of years, we have seen fascinating work in edited volumes and monographs that are bringing to light the multi-centered rise of various kinds of interwar internationalisms around the world, from the worldwide rise of radical anti-fascism to underground revolutionary networks across Asia and the Pacific. But we might still ask whether older lineages of cosmopolitanism, mentalities on which internationalism depends, dovetailed with the engagement of interwar internationalism by actors in the Global South. I come to this question as a Southeast Asianist, a region long knitted together into the world by networks of trade and communication dating at least to the 12th century. As I've written before, long before London boasted of its multiculturalism, colonial port cities like Penang and Rangoon were dotted with mosques, Buddhist temples, Hindu shrines, churches, and synagogues. These had precedents in pre-colonial cities such as Malacca and Ayutthaya and Siam, which welcomed a range of confessional groups practicing religious tolerance. The sense of other worlds and other communities was palatable and felt in these microcosms. In such cities, cosmopolitanism was a fact of life. Recently, Sujit Sivasundaram has challenged us to rethink the age of revolutions from the point of view of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, to view the way in which indigenous peoples traveled, migrated, adopted new technologies, recalibrated their politics, and challenged the crushing force of empires. In the early 20th century, another era of revolutionary change, newspaper readers, radio listeners, community organizers, and ordinary neighbors throughout Southeast Asia were inspired by the great Asian revolutions of the age, the Meiji Restoration, the Philippine Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution. This is not to discount the importance of 1919 when it happened, but it does give us a longer lineage of the global circulation of revolutionary ideas, including nationalism rooted in Asia and the wider South. In multilingual Penang of the 1920s, whose population included Malays, Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Armenians, and Eurasians, when school children heard of the League of Nations, they jokingly compared the institution to their own multicultural friendship circles. Penang's newspaper correspondents debated the merits of such an institution and wondered whether Asia deserved its own league, particularly given the failures of the organization to live up to its promises. These were promises that Penang's multilingual literati believed in: world peace, world community, and interracial friendship. In places like Penang, where Malay ethnic nationalism had not yet taken hold, alternative modes of imagining the nation, the region, and the world were both plural and dynamic. The view of internationalism from the South relied on the promise of a post-colonial world in which each nation, each community deserved its own seat at the table. The League never promised this, as everyone knew. Anti-colonial movements were resolutely internationalists, campaigning for an end to colonialism everywhere, feeding each other, creating new solidarities that lasted well into the post-war era. They overlapped with leftist internationalism, which held that the struggle against capitalism was intimately bound up with the struggle against colonialism, and that both needed to be overthrown for a truly egalitarian world to emerge. Women's internationalist networks also began to flourish in the interwar era, and Asian women directly challenged the Eurocentrism of Western women's movements. The Pan-Pacific Women's Conference, convened in 1928 in Honolulu, put non-white women from China, Japan, the Pacific Islands, and settler colonies into leadership roles. 3 years later, Indian women organized the All-Asian Women's Conference in Lahore to create a shared forum in which Asian women could converse among themselves, distinct from the so-called international and transnational networks dominated by European feminists. The organizers of the conference wanted to create a new international forum that would allow Asian women to meet and learn of each other's movements. It aimed for a radical break with European feminism in full recognition of the distinct and anti-colonial context in which Asian women campaigned. Attendees at the conference included the Sisters of the Pioneering Indonesian Feminist and Nationalists, Radha and Kartini, while one of the conference's reception committee, Hansa Mehta, became instrumental to the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In the aftermath of World War II, as the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France hosted the San Francisco conference, Asian and African leaders and leaders in waiting were already forming new solidarities and conversing about the shape of the new world. If the nationalism of the late and post-colonial era in the global South took many forms, ethnic, religious, and civic, so did its internationalism. Anti-colonial nationalism and anti-colonial internationalism were sources of unity against forces of oppression. But in post-colonial Asia, these split into various factions. Transnational communities of faith fueled religious nationalism, the elite internationalisms of post-colonial leaders, and diplomats began to entrench the role of the state. Communist and socialist parties warred with each other, drawing strength from their respective international networks. The 1955 Asian African Conference in Bandung has long been seen as an inaugural moment of third world internationalism in the global South. It set out principles of international cooperation across the Afro-Asian world, harnessed by political leaders, activists, and intellectuals for generations to come. Yet Bandung has also allied wider and more diverse histories of internationalism, some of them split along the lines I just mentioned. Apart from the new heads of state, Nehru, Nasser, UNU, and Sukarno, who thrived in new diplomatic arenas, such as Bandung's trade unionists, women, peace activists, intellectuals, and artists were also part of this moment of post-colonial world-making. As in Europe, these internationalisms collided in cities of the global south as hubs of organization. Conferences, as Stephen Legg and others remind us, served as one of the key locations where internationalism emerged in the post-war world, buzzing with life, potential futures, hope, and despair. In the post-war world, connected by new international air routes that soon displaced the steamship, attendees gained as much knowledge about internationalism and its limits from the debates had at such conferences as they did from the action of crossing borders at the pace of a jet airliner, or the new realities of passports, borders, and visa restrictions. Through the work of the Afro-Asian Networks Research Collective, an AHRC-funded collaboration, which I co-led with my colleague Caroline Stoltz, a team of researchers were invited to uncover some of these networks. This led to a digital mapping of much of this activity, coordinated with our colleague Rachel Liao. What we gained was a visualization based on the research of our team and contribution of other generous scholars of a new set of sites across the global south. It upturned the prevalent view of the history of internationalism and its dominant metropoles. In place of London, Geneva, and New York, new sites of third world internationalism emerged in Delhi, Beijing, Rangoon, Cairo, and Havana. This has dovetailed with the work of other scholars, including Jeff Byrne, Eric Burton, and Meredith Teretta, examining the new hubs of anti-colonial internationalism across the African continent, from Algiers to Dar es Salaam and Accra in the 1950s and 60s. Even before Bandung, a number of conferences had already begun assembling intellectuals, activists, women, community organizers, religious figures, and youth leaders, and people coming from all range of professions, from architects to archaeologists, dancers to doctors, under the banner of diverse internationalisms. Delhi was the site of the Asian Relations Conference, called to assess the position of Asia in the post-war world. It explicitly sought to invite individuals and organizations of diverse points of view, subscribing to religious, liberal, and socialist internationalisms. The 1952 Asia-Pacific Peace Conference in Beijing attracted a range of leftist internationalists from India to Iran, the Philippines to Peru, presided by a gathering under the banner of peace and mobilizing against Western imperial aggression. The socialist intellectuals from Lebanon to Tokyo who came to the 1953 Asian Socialist Conference in Rangoon resolved to uphold ideas of internationalism, Afro-Asian solidarity, and human rights 2 years before the Bandung Conference. Conferences in these cities brought together Asian and African internationalism for the first time. New air routes inaugurated through state-owned airlines, such as the Air India route, which ferried Asian and African intellectuals to the Afro-Asian Writers' Conference in Tashkent. Delegates visited the emerging cities of the global south via the short hops of air travel in the period along these southern air routes. Delhi emerged as a hub of the Asian peace movement, Cairo as the site of Afro-Asian people's solidarity, and Beijing as a bastion of socialist hospitality for leftist internationalists worldwide. As the site of the Asian Socialist Conference, Rangoon became a focal point for organizing among socialist intellectuals. Jakarta was the organizational home of the Afro-Asian Journalists Organization, while Colombo became the launching point of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau. Bandung was thus part of a multi-centered arc of conferences and organizations that formed the site of South-South cooperation in the 1950s, characterized by various kinds of internationalism splintered in an atmosphere of Cold War competition. If Afro-Asianism was one form of collaboration, so was Pan-Asianism, so was Pan-Africanism, and so was tricontinentalism, which grew out of these earlier movements. Entwining Asia and Africa with Latin America at a conference called by Fidel Castro in 1966. Regionalisms became internationalisms, bringing together people across the new and emerging states of the post-colonial world to meet, often for the very first time. Out of these regional and transnational connections emerged a developmental perspective that focused on the needs and imagined futures of the global South, one that undid and reimagined multilateral institutions. Scholars including Adam Getachew, Manu Bhagavan, and Christy Thornton have examined how institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank were employed by African, Caribbean, Asian, and Latin American actors as sites of pragmatic institutional change and coalition building to put the needs of the post-colonial world front and center to attempt to change the rules of the game. But there are many more stories to tell about the individuals from the global South who made the UN and its various umbrella organizations work. Actors from Southeast Asia especially have been neglected. These include U Thant, its Burmese Secretary General, and the young diplomats conversing in the halls of the UN New York headquarters. But also the Asian, African, and Latin American doctors, engineers, technicians, humanitarians, and peacekeepers working in its umbrella organizations. Uncovering their lives and their stories will help us globalize and broaden our understanding of what Jessica Reinisch and others have helpfully called the agents of internationalism. The interactions they had were collaborative and constructive, as well as contested and hierarchical. It is for this reason that we must approach these relationships without the romanticization that can often accompany Afro-Asian solidarity, but with careful attention to their aims and ambitions, their successes and failures. Conventional methodologies of international history are often insufficient to account for these deeper histories, these voices and actors from the global South. Much of the history of internationalism relies on the archives of the United Nations and other internationalist and humanitarian institutions, as well as the private papers of internationalist thinkers, largely in the global North, often kept in well-kept, publicly accessible archives and libraries. The archives of humanitarian organizations tell us much about Western agents of internationalism, but we have to look hard for the interlocutors who made their work possible and understand little about their lives. The archives of the UN and its associate institutions do often tell us about how particular actors from the global South, often elite or middle-class technocrats, use such forums. And they tell us a lot about the UN as a platform for South-South organizing and coalition building, and indeed the making of the global South as an actor on the world stage. But they often don't tell us about the domestic pressures faced by Asian, African, and Latin American actors who employed the UN as a site of contestation and campaigning. They don't tell us about the accusations they might have faced of being elitist, rootless cosmopolitans out of touch with home. They don't tell us about the racial tensions and prejudices felt by a new generation of Afro-Asian diplomats. They don't tell us about the tensions between internationalist technocrats and those activists operating transnationally outside liberal international institutions. They don't tell us how activists who avoided and distrusted the UN and other humanitarian organizations still managed to operate transnationally through peace movements, through women's movements, students' movements, labor movements, while maintaining a strong grassroots networks well outside the new urban metropoles of the global South. While recognizing the importance of the UN and other multilateral forums for actors from the global South, we must also recognize that such institutions of internationalism were not the only platforms for change. South-South forums provided parallel and often formative arenas of internationalism for transnational actors, including those that ended up at the UN. I mentioned the Asian Socialist Conference in Rangoon, which from 1953 to 1957 was both an event and an organization. It served as a home to socialist intellectuals who campaigned against the continuance of imperialism in Malaya and the African continent in spaces such as the UN. Socialist internationalists who worked in these spaces were multilingual, urban cosmopolitans, and worked alongside and in tension with socialists working at the grassroots. Some of them knew the UN well. Sultan Syahrir, the leader of Indonesia's Socialist Party, there in the middle, in the suit and tie, confidently addressed its Security Council in 1947 over the issue of Indonesian independence, drawing links to other anti-colonial movements elsewhere. One of the junior members of Syahrir's Socialist Party, Sojat Moko, on the far left in the glasses, was also with Syahrir at the meeting. Like Shahrir, he had been at Delhi's Asian Relations Conference and the Asian Socialist Conference, on which he commented extensively in the Indonesian press, and would also be at Bandung. He developed a career in internationalism, staying on to become Indonesia's representative to the UN until 1950, and forming working relationships with other Asian and African diplomats and intellectuals in the world of public policy and international development. He witnessed the development of the non-aligned bloc and the birth of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and while engaging in intellectual discussions across Southeast Asia and the wider world about history, culture, social justice, and equitable development. He wrote on the primacy of freedom in development almost 20 years before Amartya Sen's Nobel-winning book. He became, in 1982, the rector of the UN University in Tokyo, and would return to Delhi, the site of the 1949 Asian Relations Conference, to give the Nehru Memorial Lecture, affirming the need for regional cooperation and interdependence among developing and underdeveloped nations, and the history of non-alignment as a driving force for global solidarity. For Sojat Moko, the early South-South forums and conferences which he attended as a young man were formative platforms to work out development priorities and non-aligned pathways for participants across the global South, well before they arrived in the hallowed halls of the UN. Working alongside Sojat Moko in the Indonesian Socialist Party was a circle of grassroots socialists rooted in East Java, in close touch with trade unions and oil workers. They too had attended the Asian Socialist Conference, some staying on as Indonesia's representatives, but they were much less wedded to the principles of liberal internationalism, forming close ties with members of the Indonesian Communist Party. Dayino, who represented Indonesia at the organization for its first 2 years, was abruptly called back by Shahrir, possibly due to his more leftist leanings in a context where the Asian Socialist Conference hosts, the Burmese Socialist Party, was at war with its communists. Despite their differences in ideology and strategy, he would remain close to Sojat Moko until he died. As a result of her parents' activism, Dayino's daughter, Ita Fatia Nadia, became a prominent activist and married the writer Hersri Setiawan, who also became a permanent member of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau. As a feminist activist, she was inspired by a network of women of the left, both socialist and communist, who had traveled as far away as Colombo and Cairo for Afro-Asian women's conferences in 1957 and 1961. It is telling that the archives documenting the lives and writings of Sojat Moko and the Indonesian leftist women who operated at a highly international level were inaccessible to the very communities who needed to know their history. Sojat Moko's daughter, Kamala Chandrakirana, an activist and internationalist in her own right, created a digital repository of his writings because she was unable to access them through academic journals, and wanted to make them more accessible to young Indonesian historians and activists. As an independent scholar and activist, Dayino's daughter Ita had trouble getting funding to use the International Institute of Social History archives in Amsterdam to research the international networks of Indonesian leftist women, some of whom had been interviewed by her husband. I want to pause quickly to say something about women's internationalism in the post-war era, particularly as this, along with the activism of their fathers, is part of the lineage which Kamala and Ita come from. Much of what I've been speaking about here, the challenge to Eurocentric views of internationalism, the rise of South-South forums, and the UN as a platform for South-South connection, will long be recognized by historians and gender specialists in women's internationalism and transnational organizing in the post-war era. Some of the most important histories of the international women's movement from the 1970s onwards have been written by women from the global South as a mode of documenting their activism and the history of their transnational organizations. These include the history of Dawn, Development Alternatives for Women of a New Era, formed in 1984 in Bangalore on the eve of international conferences marking the UN Decade for the Advancement of Women. This created a forum for women from the global South to share experiences and strategies around alternative development processes. Economist and activist Devaki Jain's Women, Development and the UN tells the history of development as viewed from the South and documents the role of women's civil society networks in enriching the UN's work. Apart from these rich organizational histories, the archives of activists in the Global South exist in the form of personal libraries and then the memories teased out through oral history, usually in dialogue with other activists. It is through these dialogues that the rich history of transnational activism in the Global South comes alive. From the vibrant, dynamic history of leftist internationalism in Asia and Africa in the 1950s and early 60s, to the struggles of activists to cope with authoritarian regimes propped up by Cold War powers in the 60s and 70s, to a new generation of transnational activists, particularly feminists, emerging with the rise of NGOs in the 1980s, which produced a range of new South-South platforms. Penang, for instance, which I mentioned earlier, became the birthplace of the international consumer movement, giving rise to the organization Third World Network, now based in Penang and Accra. It has sought to strengthen cooperation across the Global South, particularly around equitable and sustainable development. Dawn's secretariat has rotated from Bangalore to Rio de Janeiro to Barbados to Fiji to Nigeria to Philippines and Thailand. What new perspectives do emerge when we involve the people who lived and practiced these South-South internationalisms, or those whose parents and mentors came from previous generations of transnational networking across the tricontinental world? How do multiple generations of activists in the Global South engage with these wider histories of internationalism? The methodology behind the Afro-Asian Networks project, which we wrote about as a collective in Radical History Review, was that of collaborative research, of bringing together scholars at the point of archival inquiry. But we recognized that we were scholars based at universities in the Global North, benefiting from institutional and economic inequalities in intellectual practice. As we're all too aware, the work of a global historian has long involved well-funded scholars visiting different archives and discussing ideas at international conferences, often with the ease of travel that marks the bearers of Western passports. What does it mean for the history of internationalism when Asian and African researchers are 3 or 4 times likely to face visa difficulties for short visits and ought not to attend conferences in the Global North, the historically dominant power centers of intellectual production? What does the history of internationalism look like when it is only scholars from the Global North who are able to visit the archives of international organizations or participate in international conferences and events where the history of internationalism is discussed and debated? A number of institutions and scholarly associations have opted to hold conferences in the Global South for exactly these reasons. This includes Leiden's Institute of Asian Studies, Africa-Asia's Scholarly Network, which has held conferences in Ghana and Dar es Salaam, where we are able to present our work. For a new iteration of the project, I wanted to bring together a group of scholar activists from the Global South to engage in collaborative research on global histories of the left in South and Southeast Asia. As with our previous project, this was held at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, one of the world's most important archives of leftist internationalism, holding archives of the Socialist International and the International Confederation of Trade Unions, but also important collections related to the Indonesian and Malay left. As it was in World War II, the archive's mission is to preserve the heritage of oppressed social movements around the world, particularly those under threat by the state or not included in national archives. It is worth commenting that both the Indonesian participants faced visa difficulties and were almost denied entry from the very country that had colonized them for 300 years. One, my brilliant Indonesian PhD student, opting not to come. In the end, there were 5 of us engaging in 1 week of collaborative research in Amsterdam. I tried to identify a number of scholar activists from the South, from South and Southeast Asia, keen to participate in dialogues around Afro-Asian and socialist internationalism and use the archives, those who would not normally have access to institutional funds or envision the archive as a possible repository for research. The 4 participants came from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Singapore. Some lived these histories as children of the first generation of socialist intellectuals in both countries. I mentioned Ita Fatia Nadia, the Indonesian socialist Daino's daughter, there on the left. And it was actually Ita's queries to me that initially inspired the project. Her long history of transnational activism in the region as a student activist, a feminist, a social campaigner with Third World Network, with Dawn, made her an invaluable sounding board to all of us. Agnes Koo published a book on oral histories of women involved in the Malayan Communist Party, and similarly was involved in various Singaporean activist movements in the 1980s and 90s. She has taught on development in Ghana and in Asia. Although she was an adjunct lecturer in Seoul at the time, she's recently gotten a job as a senior lecturer in Shenzhen. Fadia Nadia Fikri is a PhD candidate at the National University of Singapore who practiced as a human rights lawyer in Malaysia before embarking on a PhD to untangle the primacy of ethnic nationalism in the making of post-colonial Malaya. Sandev Handi is a curator at the Sri Lanka Museum of Modern Art, who recently put on an exhibition centered around the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau in Colombo. From the outset, the relations between the group were characterized by extraordinary dynamism, and the spirit with which we approached the archives was cooperative and interspersed with multiple conversations about resonances and differences across decades and with the present day. Though some of Agnes's previous work had taken on a comparative approach, the historical work that Fadia, Ita, and Sandev had been unearthing on the Malay, Indonesian, and Sri Lankan left had previously been centered within national frameworks, and the opportunity to discuss these within a broader context yielded a host of exciting new insights and an understanding of the ways in which transnational connections were lived. Fadia and Ita uncovered the means by which the Malay left gave support to communist women from Indonesia during the revolutionary period. Ita's husband, Hersri Setiawan, had been a member of the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, which Sandev had been researching for his exhibition. And Ita's Sri Lankan colleagues in the Asian feminist movement had inspired Sandev's own activism. We are also joined online by Kathleen Ditzig and Carlos Guinon Jr., curators respectively based in Singapore and Manila, who had recently collaborated on a digital and traveling exhibition on Afro-Southeast Asian affinities. Along with Sandev, who spoke about his recent exhibition in Sri Lanka, these three young curators showed us ways of bringing these histories of internationalism to life through art and artifacts, drawing them into contemporary histories of the image and social media. Ita told us about her work on a mobile museum, a collaboration between herself and young artists and activists to build awareness of the survivals of the 1965 political genocide against the left in Indonesia through their private archives, bicycles, dresses, shoes, notebooks, and photographs from their time on Buru Island, the notorious prison camp to which they had been sent. These survivors included Hersri, who had previously been involved in the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, and speak to the consequences faced by leftist internationalists under the repression of authoritarian regimes propped up by the US in the midst of a global Cold War. We are also joined after work by Boni Triana, the founder of the Indonesian Popular History Museum magazine Historia. Boni was in Amsterdam because he was the lead curator of a stunning new exhibition at the Rijksmuseum on the Indonesian Revolution. And we are fortunate to get a guided tour that showed us how art objects could bring to life transnational histories of revolution. The questions that this multi-generational group asked of the era of Afro-Asian solidarity were fresh, intimate, and profoundly grounded in contemporary histories of activism. Some had already been working on histories, some element of Afro-Asianism already, others on the larger histories of the left. Alongside those of us examining Afro-Asian internationalism, Fadia uncovered the internationalism of the Malayan Communist Party's 10th Regiment, a regiment made up mainly of Malay soldiers based in camps in the jungle, and found expressions of solidarity with people fighting against colonialism and imperialism elsewhere in the world. In morning seminars, we are also able to get into much deeper discussions about the nature of the left, its fractures, divisions, and the gulfs that often emerge between leftist internationalists and grassroots social movements. We'll be publishing a dialogue that stemmed from some of these discussions in the International Review of Social History and continuing conversations at a workshop on transnational activism at the University of Gadjah Mada in Indonesia next month. In highlighting the richness of these collaborative modes of research, I also wanted to point to other projects that have taken a similar approach, including East Africa's Global Lives Project, which held an archival workshop in East Africa, tracing multiple biographies of East African individuals. As their recent article contends, lives give us a richer view of the shifting nature of global connections and why these mattered, even and perhaps especially for those who were never able to travel. Individual lives matter, as I've tried to stress here, and as many of the new chapters in our forthcoming Lies of Cold War Afro-Asianism contend. And so do organizations, and so do movements, and so do the multiple forms in which internationalism in the global South came into being. To conclude, internationalism itself was lived in many different ways. International governance institutions were indeed the most permanent because of the power and resources behind them that came from the global North. Despite the hierarchies that imbued the organization, the UN's very existence relied on its members and interlocutors from the global South, as well as its engagement with civil society actors who advised the organization at both the international level and on the ground. But operating at a no less important level was civil society in the global South in its own right. For many of these actors, the UN was one platform among many, from the village, the national, the regional, the third worldist, the developmental, to address issues of global inequality. South-South forums, particularly for leftist internationalists, were much more constrained than the UN, particularly in the midst of a global Cold War. But this is precisely why they need to be recovered and assessed, particularly as new generations of activists in the global South engage in networks of solidarity against global inequality, environmental degradation, and authoritarian regimes. Kamala, Sojat Moko's daughter, recently told me that with her current work with feminists in Sri Lanka and India, we have no storyline that connects our work today with history, with the old links. These links have been hindered by language barriers, by colonial legacies that created more connections with the metropole and subverted connections across the South, and by the rise of regimes that suppressed leftist activism and distorted its histories. All these have made these connections harder to stitch back together. If we want to bring these histories to life and to understand how internationalism was lived as well as practiced, we must engage with life histories from multiple geographical and political perspectives. The act of decolonizing history, of undoing, challenging, and questioning structures of power must also be an act of democratizing history, of globalizing history, of stitching back together and forming new regional connections across the South. It must involve making the archives of internationalism more accessible, of broadening our view of internationalism, of understanding what internationalism looks like from the point of view of activists who speak truth to power, of creating opportunities for activists to meet across borders and recover these histories collaboratively. This can only enrich our collective understanding of internationalism, and in so doing, animate the narratives we tell about its multi-centered histories. Thank you.
Susan, thank you ever so much. It was an absolutely wonderful paper and took us into a very different world from some of our recent lectures. So brilliant. You see, thank you also to our remote audience who are sending their caps via Zoom. I can see they're in the corner. Questions? I'd like to open the floor to questions. Go ahead. Can I just, I'm just going to repeat the questions so that the people on Zoom can hear what the questions are. Sorry, now I'm going to forget immediately what the question is. You're asking for clarification between internationalism and transnationalism. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a really good question. And I think we've all been grappling with those questions for a while, but I think the transnational tends to encompass a more broader range of interactions, I think, between, in kinds of movements, and people moving, around the world, in activists, especially organizing, intellectuals, those kinds of discussions. I think international tends to relate to kind of, interstate forms, but I think it also relates, I think it can also speak to broader interactions that are happening between, we have to remember internationalism relies on kind of nationalism. And in a way, a lot of people are using the word internationalism to relate specifically, especially from the global south, to relate specifically to anti-colonial movements, to nationalist movements, and thinking about the way those relate to each other. So I think that, you know, I use the word internationalism because I think it's important here to think about, because I think it's been used a lot to apply to, you know, these institutions in the global north. But I think that, you know, when we think about these South-South forums, those are also internationalist forums. They're not just, you know, transnational in terms of kind of, you know, grassroots interactions, or I think they are attempting to create a new international world, and a better international world. So I hope that's good and simple.
Melissa.
I had a question about to what extent this is an urban history story. So these are urban elites.
Yeah.
So is there, well, there must be a story to tell also about internationalism outside of cities.
Okay, yeah. So this question is just about, this is you've been talking about urban elites. Can we extend the story outside the cities?
Yeah, no, I think my background has tended to focus on urban history before, and I am kind of interested in the urban elites and cosmopolitan intellectuals, but I think that I've also been interested in the way in which those kind of cosmopolitan intellectuals relate and have tensions with other internationalists working at, you know, outside those urban centers. And I think those are the kind of questions that we were trying to get at, especially in this collaborative workshop, that became very clear to us. You know, the kind of leftist internationalists, this kind of democratic socialist internationalists working in those broader literati intellectual forums, often there was tension existing between those activists as well as kind of people operating more on the ground and outside those centers. And I think that teasing out that kind of internationalism outside the cities is a much harder task. And I think that, you know, it has to involve more oral histories, more groundwork, more ethnohistory, which is sometimes called anthropological work. And yeah, it's sometimes a more difficult task of recovery. But, you know, as Fadia found, you know, looking at this 10th Regiment, you know, it's quite interesting how internationalist people can be even outside cities. And we can think about the means by which that happens. You know, is it radio? Is it, you know, is it propaganda? How are they using that? How are they, you know, why is that appealing? So I think that, yeah, these are it opens up a lot of different questions. So thank you.
I wonder if I could just, yeah, I'll come to you, following on from both of those questions. Again, I'm another non-expert, and I'm just interested in the language side of things. So, I mean, as a historian, I think it's, you know, really interesting how you can be working in potentially many different languages, but it also makes me wonder how, at the time, people were communicating amongst themselves, and how, you know, what role language barriers and difficulties might have, or both for you as a historian, but also at the time, how that aided or impeded communication.
Yeah, I think that this again is another issue, and I think that, you know, because of the language barriers between areas, often it was the colonial languages that served as a way to, you know, stitch together, and it was the bilingual kind of elites and intellectuals and activists that sometimes could end up speaking to each other in these forums, in these conferences that we were looking at. So I think that kind of leads to new questions about who is left out, and who, and, you know, to what extent are these people actually in touch with people on the ground, and I think, yeah, again, those tensions are kind of being brought out, but I think that language issue is definitely one major.
Thank you. So there are some questions in the room. I'll just also point out that, yeah, I don't know why the screen has suddenly turned up a bit unbeautiful, but do, if you're listening online, do feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll try and scoop those up and feed some of those to Sue-Lin as well. Get them. Great, thank you.
Are you able to say anything at a general level about the impact of these internationalist
organisations you've looked at on international policy making? And if so, how has that impact changed over the time period you've looked at?
It's a good question. I feel like there's so much more discussion now among international forums about civil society engagement and engaging kind of, civil society at an international level and a grassroots level. And when you're in a humanitarian organization, working with civil society. And it's kind of interesting thinking about where that came from and how that, what happened before the 1990s, and was that an issue? And I think it was. I just don't think it's been documented as well. But and I think that's one of the tasks, thinking about, well, what is the impact of civil society? We get a lot of histories of internationalism about diplomats and people working within the UN, but what is the impact of those outside organizations, and especially organizations from the global south, and how are they changing the organization? So I think it's a really good question to think about as we move forward.
Rebecca.
Thanks very much. Related questions. You said something about, quite intriguingly, about the nature of the left. And that the very concept of the left is, as a course of your sort of collective scholarship, this kind of new mode of sort of decentered scholarship, the very nature of the left. You found this, I guess, being questioned. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about what is this
The left
kind of new sort of intellectual, ideological sort of what you found in that course of deconstructing or finding what these new fractures were. And then the other thing that struck me, I like this expression when you said we need to look hard to uncover the history of internationalism. And I just wondered if you could say more what looking hard could mean, like not just looking more broadly at different types of sources, new archives, new private, memoirs, new, sort of private archives, but also what looking hard maybe conceptually and kind of practically means. And so how does one look hard at the sources that are already there and also these new sources? And if you could just say what that might mean for you and also your collaborators.
Yeah, okay, so
Just Tracy the question. You're very well. Do you want to praise them before you answer?
No, go ahead.
I'm sure you can probably do that much more. I'm sure you can do that much more skillfully than I can. But for our audience at home, we've got a question about the left and unpacking a little bit the left at this particular period, and again another question about looking hard and what in reality that might mean to look hard at this new, this material. Yeah, go ahead.
I think the question about left divisions on the left is one that is really interesting, and I could have gotten more into it, but I think that especially, the people that I was looking at, especially in the socialists, are kind of democratic socialists. They're more center left, and some of them are more. There's a kind of, even within that group, there are people that are more critical of like the Soviet Union, and some that are more, that we need to be treating the Soviet Union and America in both the same way because they're both neo-imperialists. And there's kind of these socialists, a lot of the tensions that are emerging in that group, but also the real tensions that are emerging between the socialists and the communists. And I think that a lot of this is exacerbated by a context in the Cold War, where you have a lot of patronage that's emerging from the Soviet Union, from China, from America. America was sponsoring a lot of leftist organizations, but so were the Soviet Unions, and I think there's a tension there. And first, I work on kind of Yangon or Rangoon in the 1950s, and it's really fascinating the amount of funding and competition that's going on in that city. And some activists that I interviewed say that grew up in that world say, oh, it was great, there was we really could benefit from the competition. But it was also one that was incredibly, because they were running in between the Moscow's film workshops in the Soviet embassy, and like going to the library in the US embassy, and and there was a lot of is a really dynamic time. And for a time, you could kind of be neutral and, you know, non-aligned and take money from both sides, which is kind of what was the development strategy of non-aligned countries was at the time. But it soon became, especially towards the end of the 50s, quite difficult to hold that stance. And I think that there are a lot of cleavages that happened with the Cold War as things became a lot more intense, the kind of conflicts, both at the domestic level and the international level. So I think all these are affecting civil society as well. You know, the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, for instance, that was based in Colombo, and the Afro-Asian Journalists Association that was initially based in Jakarta, both of them developed splinters where they both, one arm of both of them moves to Beijing and another arm, you know, kind of stays in Colombo. In the case of the Afro-Asian Writers, or moves to Cairo. And yeah, so there's a real split in these organizations along these lines of, you know, along these, you know, Soviet, you know, how much are they looking to the Soviets, how much are they countering them or China, and how much are they, you know, taking American money? There's a lot of, you know, divisions that are happening because of that. In terms of looking hard, I think I just mean it can be easy, I think, when you look at these, you know, international organizations, to focus on the people that are often written about, whose correspondence we have, you know, that is very well documented. But sometimes there are kind of interlocutors there that are doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, like from, you know, Asian or African nations that we're not focusing on as much because we have less documented about what they thought, what they're doing. So I think there's a skewing in the archives, in archives of internationalism towards Western actors, especially, and that's not always the case. But I think that's what I mean by looking hard. We need to kind of look at the people that are, you know, mentioned but not really, you know, and who clearly have a big role, but we need to kind of just read against the grain a little bit and think about how they are marginalized, what kind of power dynamics exist in those archives, and thinking a little bit more carefully about what we're using.
Thank you both. Are there questions in the room, or shall we take some of them?
Yeah, and there are lots of questions coming in on the chat. Some of them are folks, I'll summarise some of them. Alan Price asks, who funded the conferences? What's the infrastructure for making them possible and making it available through travel?
Okay. So for a simple question there, about who's funding the conferences, who's funding the travel? Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, you know, originally some of these conferences are being funded by, you know, new states. You know, Indonesia puts a lot of funding into the Bandung conference and the Afro-Asian Students Conference that follows. There's a, you know, Beijing is a big sponsor of the Asia Pacific Peace Conference. Nasser is a big funder of the, and the Soviet Union actually is a big funder of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference in '57. And sometimes that becomes an excuse for the Americans to say, oh, it's just a communist front. You know, the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference is just a communist front because the Soviets are funding it. But it really doesn't get at the point of, you know, how people are taking that money, how people are using it, creating kind of new forms for dialogue. So I think that, again, we kind of have to be careful about you know, just saying, well, because they funded it, like clearly the ideological bent is towards that, you know, they're under the whim of those powers. So
I had some more joining on stage. There's some more questions from the chat. Several of them are asking about whether definitions of global south changed through your work for you, in terms of, because this is about mobility, whether preconceptions of what global south meant have evolved as a consequence of looking at the networks.
Yeah, I was wondering if someone was going to pick me up on that, but yeah, I think it does, and certainly a place like Singapore, which certainly sees itself as part of the global South in the 50s and 60s, is really trying to drive forward and not be a first world actor, and it's quite interesting the way in which that happens, and so I think that there are places that are kind of disrupt our view of, but it's not to say that there are not activists in those countries that are very much creating, forums with other actors in developing countries and still trying to kind of campaign for certain issues that are more regional and affecting, issues around development and elsewhere. So yeah, China, is an actor that is supporting a lot of, socialists from Indonesia and East Africa and elsewhere, but it is not, I don't know to the extent that can be considered a country in the global South. I don't think it can, but it's nonetheless a really important hub for a lot of that interaction to occur.
Question from Giorgio Di Meo online says, thank you, Celine, wonderful lecture, and asks, is in the formation of the resistance movements in Southeast Asia in the second half of the 20th century, were there elements of continuity with similar currents already active in the 19th century, or were these original organizations?
I think it's difficult to think about continuities with organizations in the 19th century, partly because of issues around education, around the difficulty of mobilizing, and so I can't think of particular organizations. It's not to say that that certain forms of radicalism weren't there in the late 19th century, but I think that they were it was a lot more difficult. I mean, traveling, kind of colonial regimes, but I do, I think there's a certain way in which the press, the rise of the press, the increasing nature of mobility, in especially the kind of late 19th, early 20th century is allowing more of these connections to occur. Yeah.
And one last question from the chat. This is quite a particular one from Jonathan Harris. Says, have you considered or come across UNITAR as a potential forum for South-South cooperation, or was it too hamstrung by the UN agency and the demands of the northern donors?
No, I haven't. but I will look into that. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Any more questions in the room? Hello. Two more, so I'll get you first.
Thank you. Thanks so much for such a fascinating lecture. I have a question about whether you saw internationalism during this period as a kind of a mass movement or a popular movement, because you talked obviously about kind of uncovering this history beyond the kind of cosmopolitan narrative, cosmopolitan elite, and we've talked a little bit about some of the kind of methodological problems behind that. And I just wondered whether, is that just a methodological problem, that this internationalism exists in the kind of general population, but it's hard to uncover beyond these kind of archives, archives, or does it reflect the fact that it is kind of an elite movement, in that it's very popular among certain groups of intellectuals, but it maybe doesn't have as much kind of clout amongst all of these?
Brilliant. So mass movement or elite movement, to Tracy very crudely produced.
You mean the people that I've been the three movements I've been tracing, are they mass movements or elite movements?
Yeah, during this kind of Afro-Asian
era. Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say, as I mentioned, a lot of these conferences, they contain very diverse individuals, especially these kind of peace movement conferences, really coming from such a range of different professions and, labor organizers, as well as kind of more, statesmen and venerated religious figures, that kind of thing. So there is a sense in which it's varied, but I'd say kind of more that organizers tend to be more. I mean, some of them do come from grassroots backgrounds, but I think that there are. We often find with some of these figures that they do come from, more middle-class families. Even if someone like Ho Chi Minh, or they come from, even if their families have been, gets downgraded by the state or whatever, they're still kind of coming from quite literate families. So, but I'd say they really diverse cast of characters, but I do wonder if these kind of activist circles, they tend to attract more middle class literati intellectuals, people that are capable of organizing quite a lot of people. So I think it's something somewhere in the middle, I'd say.
Brilliant, thank you. That makes me think of cultural capital. Even when they've been downgraded, they've got the capital to do all of this. Yeah, it's really interesting. Question up there.
My question was, so a lot of the issues that the global south member countries face, poverty, climate justice, cultural assimilation, eventually they're tackled by our traditional international bodies like the UN, as well as NDGs and SDGs can be mentioned. I was curious, as we talk about reforming some of that internationalist outlook and reorienting ourselves to study that internationalism, are there specific problems across the global south that benefit from that change in outlook more than others? And how so?
Can you just repeat? So you're saying, are there specific countries in the global south that have benefited from the change in?
I mean, so a lot of the countries in the global south have benefited from the traditional international organizations and the leaders as part of the post-colonial organizations that were set up, including the UN bodies that drive a lot of poverty reduction and development programs across the countries, like these traditional internationalist organizations. So as we sort of aim to shift our focus towards an alternate set of agents in that same space, for example, the organizations mentioned in the slide, are there specific areas where we can actually improve the solution process for poverty, climate justice, cultural preservation, and life, and so on and so forth, by shifting the way we study history and study how we discover stuff?
So the question is, can we shift to, if we shift from the international institutions to other forums? Is that the question?
For example, my influence of this lecture was that in the way we talk about history and we study and approach history, it's important to not just focus on the international leaders or the internationalist organizations, but also look at the alternative sort of sections, for example, the organizations which we have. So I'm just trying to extend out the focus and see what it leads to, and does it help any of the global south countries in solving their problems better?
Oh, okay. It's a difficult question, because I think you're asking what happens, I guess, policy-wise, or when we shift our perspective about internationalism from diplomats and these highly internationalist forums to more activist histories. No, it's actually a really good question, and I think that I mean, I had a stint working for a UN organization for a while, humanitarian work, and I think that that whole world of kind of traveling around in a white SUV to humanitarian sites, saying that you're going to solve problems for people that have moved out of villages. I mean, there's a sense in which those problems after a disaster need to be helped by massive logistics, and there's no doubt about that. But I think that we also have to recognize where there are, how do we strengthen the capacity of civil society to do the work, to kind of, to get funding, to recognize their role in these longer histories of civil society of activism that really kind of disrupts our view of countries as victims, but actually thinks about, how do we strengthen and really, that level of civil society? How do we, how can we actually make development and aid workers more unnecessary, right? So I think that's part of what I'm thinking about here. But it's also, I guess, recognizing, the role that civil society has played in shaping the UN, in serving as a counterforce and thinking about those demands and taking them seriously, which I think is happening. But I think there's much more to be done. So,
thank you. Please.
Hello, thank you very much indeed. I had a question about the position of Japan in Afro-Asian networks at this period of time. It strikes me if you were thinking about 1900, that Japan would be absolutely core of Afro-Asian movements. And it's quite a small node from the map you have behind you. Of course, you managed to expand.
Yeah. It's a really good question. So you were asking about the role of Japan in these networks, and Japan sent a little delegation to Bandung. The socialist intellectuals were particularly interested in what was going on with these Afro-Asian networks, and there was a big delegation that was involved in the Asian Socialist Conference, and they had bureau meetings in Tokyo, so that the socialists at that time were in opposition to the main, the main party, the Liberal Party in Japan, and so they're quite interested in creating these kind of broader networks. Partly there's anger against Japan because of, the World War II, and especially in Southeast Asia, and I think some of the socialists are trying to remedy, what happened and think about, okay, well, how do we say that, okay, well, we weren't involved, we were speaking out against the government, and how do we kind of think more about how we're participating in the region? But a lot of it is about development funding and trying to also think about how they stitch back their connections with the region because of economic reasons, and raw materials. And so I think that there's an interesting, and I think that there's not a lot, I think that more needs to be done about Japan's kind of global, wider global connections. But I'm not a Japanese historian, so I'll just put it out there. Yeah.
Sorry, this is a completely late person's question. To what extent do you think participation in these conferences and strengthening of transnational identities and networks influence the way in which pluralism was emphasized in the nation building project at home in these countries?
That's a good question. I think that so it's about how a lot of these interactions influenced discourses of pluralism in these post-colonial countries. I think that a lot of these histories have been sort of not written out in a way. I think there's a lot of histories of this period that is very much about post-colonial nationalism, the building of the state. And I think people are now trying to recover a lot of the internationalism of this period, to think about, how does Indonesia become so interested in what's happening in North Africa or what's happening in, Vietnam, and that kind of sense of wider internationalism, this was a very internationalist age in the 1950s. And, there were all, again, connections, especially among the left, the center left, were very strong. But I do think they have been sort of forgotten about. And I think that it's quite interesting, thinking about why, my Indonesian PhD student, for instance, is very, interested in recovering these histories because it has been so you know, repressed in a way. And so I think that there's a difference between the pluralism and the globalism of that period, especially as a kind of source of solidarity, and then kind of how it all, you know, got buried. So I don't know, you know, it's brittle. It's that the internationalism is brittle, it's constrained. It didn't manage to last, especially past the 1950s. And I think those are interesting questions as to why that happened. Thank you.
Sulin, I think you have answered many, many questions. And I think we've really, you may be feeling a little bit exhausted at this point. Before, we're going to close formally in a moment, and I will thank Sulin. But before we go, I'd just like to let everybody who's listening, both online or who's in the room today, about our next lecture, which is going to take place on the 1st of November, and is going to be given by the BBC broadcaster and author Kavita Puri. She'll be speaking on the subject of Indian partition, 75 years on. That'll be the 1st of November. Anybody planning to come along in person, it's not going to be held in this theatre, but look at our website and all the information about where it will be held will be communicated there. And we've also got online, a fully online event on Thursday, the 13th of October, an international panel hosted by Professor James Vernon at the University of California in Berkeley, New Histories of Neoliberalism. You'll find out all about forthcoming events on our website, basically. If you are not a member of the Society, let me take this opportunity to welcome you to, again, look at our website. We've got categories for everybody, whatever your relationship to history, we will have a membership category for you, and we're always interested to welcome new people into the Society. For those of you who are in the room here today, we're going to adjourn to our council chamber, which is just behind here, for a glass of wine or a drink, whatever you like. Do come and join us if you'd like to speak to Sulin or introduce yourselves to us. But for now, much the most important thing for me to do is to thank Sulin for a truly wonderful lecture. I think we all learned so much, and I think even more than that, it gave us a lot to think about as well. So really an absolute triumph. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll want to join in.
This is like if you break it.